Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is,
Stephanie Batiste, a professor at UC Santa Barbara.
and wonderful to meet you, Prof. Very exciting for me. I wanted to start with my stereotypical query that I pose to everybody pretty much, which is to ask what's currently dynamizing, preoccupying, interesting, or impeding you?
I think that I have one answer that corresponds to all of those possibilities, and that's the balance between work and life, but also, as a big part of that, what it means to pay attention to my vessel, the body, like what kinds of activities, necessary attentions, decisions and awarenesses are going to be necessary to get me through, another 50 years. I know that in many ways I've taken my body's service to myself for granted, and I'm ready to try and stop, you know?
Can I ask you a bit more about that? Because
Sure.
very often the scholarly body, unless I guess you're doing human movement studies or archaeology and you're digging a lot,
Hmm.
involves sitting around, sitting in one
Yes,
place. But
right.
your scholarly body does that, but it also is something that you rely on in performance.
Hmm.
I wonder if you could
As much,
just
go ahead.
think about that for a moment. Tell us about that relationship, as it were.
Yeah, as much as I can, I get up on my feet, right? But to the extent that the scholarly body is sedentary, that really is 90% of my scholarly life. Because in some ways, creating the space for me, a kind of person who was trained in American studies and became a cultural studies scholar through method and interest. My scholarly work, I think, has become the foundation that justifies the artistic ventures that I take. And so I've spent a lot of time, and I used to think when I was younger that the sedentary body was a safe way to age. Like, I'm not doing any damage to myself. I'm not overextending anything. And that's really not the case. The sedentary body is a body that's very much in danger of various kinds of illnesses, problems, pains, uh, and, you know, learning to counteract that and allow, and maybe it's performance that teaches me this or has been teaching me this over the years, is that your mind is in your body, that it doesn't exist someplace else. So in order to enliven, learn from, experience, access, innovation, inspiration, that the body has to be in motion. Um, for instance, I was writing, there's an article I have in the New Centennial Review that's about our mutual friend, Rickerby Hines' play Dreamscape. And that's a very intense play about the police shooting of Taisha Miller, a young black woman who was sitting in her car at a gas station in Rubidoux, California. And Professor Hines wrote this play called Dreamscape, where he imagines the character, Maisha Mills, performing a relationship to her body as each bullet enters each particular area. You might know this play, you might have seen it. The genius actress Rachel, oh, I'm not remembering her name right now. Um, uh, I've worked with her quite a lot since encountering her in Dreamscape, would perform in emotion and narrate in poetry this relationship, story making that came from the body. So when I was trying to deal with this play about state violence and murder, I had to get up and walk around my office. So, especially when I got to the end in the last couple of paragraphs, I would stand up and I would have to walk around the room and then I would sit down. I would try and write another sentence. Stand up and walk around the room and I would sit down and then try and write another sentence. And in that particular moment, it became really clear that I couldn't, like, the both emotional necessity of dealing with the subject matter and the process of getting the sentences out was a full-bodied experience. And people I know who work in kinetics, somatics, dance sort of understood this immediately. But people on the English department hallway were like, oh, that's wow.
Well,
That's really
Prof,
interesting.
my friend Faye Ginsberg says that you study what you're not good at. So she says,
Huh.
psychologists are frightened of people, anthropologists are frightened of difference, economists can't run businesses, literary critics can't write poetry or novels,
Hmm.
etc. Right? Now,
Hmm.
I like the idea of studying, and all the communications professors I know can't work with technology, have no clue about anything. So
Okay.
it's a provocative notion, but I think there's something very interesting there when you talk about being a performer, but when you're writing about performance, in a sense, jeopardizing that bodily element because you become the sedentary subject. Yeah.
Yeah.
Other
Like,
than
yeah.
when you're animated by something shocking like the subject matter you were writing about. You know
Hmm.
what I mean? So I'm
Yeah.
not I'm not suggesting you're not good at performance because you study it, but I in this case, but I'm suggesting that it can be forgotten. The centrality of the
Mm.
body you've been talking about, and the centrality of the body to the mind rather than their separation. But this can be an issue for lots of performing faculty.
Mm. Yeah, I think our scholarly training teaches us to tighten things up, to iron them out, to communicate them in a way that's accessible, to harness and control ideas, to translate, to interpret. And it's funny, I was thinking about this morning when I was laying in bed is how to get my students. I'm teaching a performance of literature class right now, and I am actually using it to study performance methodology for myself. So with other scholars, I've been thinking through, like, what does it mean to do scholarship and somehow allow scholarship to access performance as methodology, as subject, as theory, and accept, I think cultural studies scholars know that the people we're studying are doing the theorizing and we're translating it and offering it as a kind of like channel or conduit. So for me, the performers are the theorists, and in the book that I have due in a couple of weeks, I'm looking at performances that process street murder and violence in Los Angeles. And that project is what I call multimodal. And other colleagues of mine have also been thinking about what it means to write with performance as methodology, um, and perform with scholarship as methodology. And so I've been thinking about how to get my students, and I'm imagining this in because I want to put this on the chalkboard for them. I'm imagining this in shapes, like how to get my students to understand that if they themselves are like a circle of being, and the knowledge they have to access is a rectangle, like what's the relationship between themselves as a circle and the knowledge that they're trying to master as a rectangle. And through most of their lives, their rectangle is separate and they need to kind of fill it in with knowledge and then they're done. But I think when you get to college, the rectangle and the circle have to get closer together and they have to touch. And that Venn diagram is the place where innovation, inspiration can happen. And maybe that rectangle becomes another circle. And then maybe the side of that circle opens up to the world. And now inspiration, innovation can help the student to learn and create something. And in this performance studies class, performance of literature, we're actually taking theatrical jazz plays and studying them and then working through them and trying to put portions of them on their feet and then going to the next play. Um, I need the students to find a way to open to creativity and possibility and vulnerability. Like maybe the other side, their own circle opens to the world at some point. But some students are kind of, and in my literature classes, I'll say, the difference between, I'll tell you, the difference between like a B and an A in at university is your ability to bring yourself to your work. And this is even more, and so I start to get much more interesting interaction between the students and the things I'm trying to teach them. And I need that interaction, that interactivity between their mastery of what they're reading in front of them and the kind of full-bodied interpretation, analysis, engagement that I'm asking them to do in performance studies. And I'm not trying to say that this is always liberatory. I think at Northwestern and maybe NYU in the performance studies department, the students who are required to make performance as part of their PhDs are not necessarily finding the performance piece as freeing. I'm not sure dance scholars are like, oh, I'm choreographing this thing I have to make for my tenure and I'm liberated. But in this piece, and getting sort of traditional scholars, myself even, that kind of are trained to harness and produce theory by sitting in one place, to understand how that happens in motion, and then once again translate that either as performance or as writing is fascinating to me. Um,
And pedagogy can be an important part of this, as you've just noted. So, in reading Stacks of Obits, your extraordinary piece, you've involved the students very much in that, haven't
yeah,
you?
yes, I have. Thank you for reading that. I appreciate it. Uh, it was a solo show initially, so I was performing by myself, reading, not impersonating, but sort of bringing other voices in and playing them. And really, the narrative part of the show stayed a monologue. I performed that myself. But there was this opportunity I had to bring students into the process. And teaching at UC Santa Barbara, I was studying Los Angeles too as part of my larger Scarlet book project. Um, we had students from Los Angeles who were crump dancers. And so one of my chapters in this book was on crump and thinking about how this sort of social dance in Los Angeles from over the millennial period was operating in community and making meaning. And so these dancers became a part of my show. Uh, and then, so I had three dancers, and then I think, if I recall, I had three other students they did some singing. They helped with stage geography. They peopled some of the collective moments in the play. And I brought on a graduate student in theater and dance to direct. And so we published a reprint together where we worked on dramaturgy together. And so the getting students on stage, getting them to bring their own artistic practices towards scholarship, was one of the things that we were able to accomplish, and we performed that on campus.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the animation of the performance, what was driving it as well for you.
Well, my first cousin was killed in a drive-by in the year 2000. And so in my family, we have, I come from a family that lives in Los Angeles. Both my mother and father's parents migrated from New Orleans to Los Angeles. Um, and so we're sort of part of that uh, um, second Great Migration wave of Black people who came from the South to the West after World War II. And uh, on my father's side of the family in particular, we had just lost a lot of men. Um, and they, from different causes, some natural, most natural. Like my uncle, my dad's older brother, had a heart attack when he was 49, and he had like this vision that he told my mother that he never saw himself old, could never see himself older than 50. And you know, he had had a son who passed away before his first year. Uh, and there are others since then. Um, but my cousin was about 17. He was a senior in high school and he had played in this football game and he was, you know, driving around enjoying the evening and the victory with his friends in a car and some people drove by and shot him to death. And his friends, this story is in the play Stacks of Obits. It never gets easier to perform and it never really gets easier to tell. And so his friends took him and they laid him on the driveway outside of the emergency room at I think it's Charles Drew Hospital in South LA, and they started to drive away, right? And to me, there's such an intense love, dedication, and fear in their action that it just so broke my heart. And then it happened that my sister knew the wife of the surgeon who was working on my cousin, trying to revive him. He had his hands in his heart, massaging his chest. Like there are these ways that I have these pieces of the story that are just like impossible somehow to know, you know? Um, and then, you know, when the boys were trying to drive away, there was a police car that stopped them. So there's a way that their fear was validated, that they were going to face, you know, now an institutional criminal encounter in a space when they're in shock, likely, and certainly in
1970.
mourning. Yeah, with the loss of their friend. I mean, they're in the car, their friend is shot, and their friend is dying, and they're trying to figure out what to do. These are teenagers, you know. And so, and then I learned it became clear that my younger sister, who was about 15 at the time, was collecting funeral programs because her friends were getting shot in the street and gang violence. And it seemed to me such a paradox from the point of knowledge and knowledge making. Um, the geographical and class crossings that happen in Black communities in urban settings, um, the kind of the fundamentally different relationship to systems of feeling, like how you are made up as a person with out of feelings, seemed to me fundamentally different between mainstream America and Black America. And we knew this with civil rights, right? But here we are, sort of at the turn of the millennium, uh, experiencing in new ways that, you know, there is no such thing as the pursuit of happiness, that there is a fundamental uh, affective difference between people who have different experiences. You are constituted differently in feeling. Um, and so and you know, there was this affective turn in the academy, and it sounded very gobbledygook, even when it was coming from African American scholars actually trying to shift towards what it and scholars of color trying to shift what it meant to talk about affect and feeling amidst communities of color, to think that like a kind of normative, heteronormative, mainstream white notion of how feeling operates was very narrow way of thinking about affect and feeling when we think about knowledge and embodiment. And so I really thought that that turn was failing when it came to my people. And I wanted to think about feeling. And then I don't know if the psychological process of this was like, okay, let's make it scholarship and theory, was a movement away from feeling that grief. And that division also was something I was trying to unify in doing this work, is how do we ethically and with embodied commitment address these social historical issues, and also the tender part of it that is someone else's private vulnerability in feeling, and do that respectfully. And the only way I could think about it was through the integration of performance. Um, in concept, in interaction, in writing, in theorizing, because up to the point of at least starting the project, the vulnerability of the population being studied, I felt was not integrated into the discussion of feeling that scholars are trying to produce. And the responsibility for that feeling didn't seem to me either to be making its way into the project. When I would ask people working on affect, well, how do you deal with the trauma of being responsible for telling these kinds of stories? They had nothing for me. Nothing. And I was like, oh, this is something that we haven't figured out yet. And for me, in scholarship, in performance, I'm always interested in, okay, how do we get into this thing that we haven't figured out yet? You know, in my first book, it was called Darkening Mirrors. I was writing about Black people representing Blackness. And every time I started to say, I'm looking at, Black theater in the 1930s, and they're like, oh, are you comparing it to, white theater in the 1930s? And I was like, and I would just say no. And that was a radical thing to do back then. No one could conceive of me writing a project that was about Black performances of Blackness. Not just I'm studying Black theater, I'm going to go look at these troupes, but where do we take this idea of the way in which Blackness circulates and operates in society? And we see a lot of theorizing about how whites perform, interact with Blackness in various ways, liberal ways, white supremacist ways. But to me, Blackness was always the object of that study. So what we hadn't figured out yet was how to do a study that allowed Black subjectivity to be actually the center of that study, the space from which knowledge making was produced that wasn't necessarily oriented towards resistance or second class citizenship. The thing we hadn't, at that point, to me, the thing we hadn't figured out yet. And so, with this project on Black feeling, on violence and death in urban settings over the millennial era, the thing we hadn't figured out yet was how to deal with Black feeling, and then also how to deal with gang violence and its emotional impact that weighs down on a community. I apologize. I'm a professor. I'm used to talking a lot. So I get to talking and I keep talking. So I don't
Prof,
know. What do you
please,
have questions for
you,
me?
I asked you quite a provocative question about what was driving you in this work. And I think it was incredibly valuable that you talked about your own feelings and experiences as a family member in the face of this tragedy of violence against a young Black man, the killing of a young Black man. It also helped because, as you know, but listeners may not, there's a bachelorette party going on in the background. And when you were talking, the groom appeared with a bunch of flowers and was greeted with screams of appreciation by the gals sitting around the table. So it was really good that I was being silent with my microphone turned off, apart from anything else. But in a sense, picking up some of those themes, I wanted to ask you about another of your works, Close/By, BYE, which
Mhm,
touches on issues of Black emotion and solidarity.
mhm,
I think it's fair to say. And I
mhm.
wondered if you could talk a bit about that, including correcting any misapprehensions I've just given people.
Well, no, I don't think you've given anyone a misapprehension, but really taught me something about the piece that I hadn't really thought about. That this notion of solidarity is it's endemic to the process of making the piece. The Mhm. So I never really intended to be writing about trauma. And I have a former student, a PhD student, who's a beautiful memoirist, um, who said to me once, she's like, "What's only one of the languages you speak?" And so that was a real gift. Her name was Ming Holden for her to give me. Uh, and so I was teaching a class on Black California literature. And we were looking at Roger Denver Smith's performance on Huey Newton. We were looking at um, other Black California writers over the course of the 20th century. For the most part, one of my favorites is Dana Johnson, who's a short story writer, teaches down at USC. Um, and there, and there was so much going on in that particular moment. We had Rolando Castile, we had Mike Brown being murdered by police, we had um, Eric Garner, right? And we're right on the heels of all of these police murders, and we're talking about blackness in California, and we're talking about a little bit about black radical movements, but a lot about just the texture of black experience and black feeling. And there was one day when I asked the students to take 1 minute, and this was already like 10 years ago, I think, from now and ish. And I asked them to study for 1 minute one of the murders that had happened. Sandra Bland had been um, uh, killed or had passed away. And I said, just pick one of these names, study it for 1 minute, and then write for five. And the things they wrote, the poems that they wrote, were so beautiful. I think that all of them were experiencing something in this moment that they didn't really have words for. And so this short assignment that was really meant to work us through one of the more, and I don't remember which one it was. Maybe it was a study around Huey Newton. We had read, I'm on the spot, so I'm not remembering the name of the writers, but we had read about the police shootout in Oakland. I think that was maybe the thing that there were two young Black Panthers who were hunted, chased down and murdered by the police. Famous shootout in Oakland. Uh, and it's just a lot to do in the classroom. And so I was like, okay, well, we're saturated right now in this particular story. So how do you, as human beings in this space, find voice to talk together, to shift that responsibility between, like, here's a group of people that I'm responsible for talking to and teaching them something, to create a room of people who are in conversation with each other to deal with this harrowing situation that we're in. And we knew that we were going to create a performance that was sort of an adaptation of the literature. That's what the class is, performance of literature. The way I teach it, I ask students to stage their analysis, really. What is their critical engagement with the text in relationship to the theory that we've read? What's happening in the text? How do you give us words from the text that tell us what you think about it? And now create a situation or a performance that engages the text. And students do really amazing work. But these poems that they wrote about each of these victims of state violence became the spine for Close By. So we'd have a student poem, and then we'd have, an adaptation that the students made. But invariably, the adaptations of the literature that the students made were connected to this environment of death that we were living in, of anti-Black violence that we were living in the U.S. Uh, so, for instance, there's this novel that I don't love at all by Chester Himes called If You Holler, Just Let Him Go. But the first 5 to 10 pages of it that are anthologized in this volume by Aparajita Ananda uh, have this Black man in a sort of dream state between being asleep and being awake in the morning. And I kept focusing in with them on this phrase that described his body turning. So he would wake up for a moment and then he would turn, and then he would sleep a little bit more and sort of experience both wakeful dreaming and nightmares, really, that are in the story. And then we had Lucille Clifton with a poem about um, the turning. First scene that one group of students made was in relationship to Heinz, and they animated this turning, and we put a big clock, projected a big clock on the wall, and so the turning of his body was like a kind of existential epistemic turning of time. And they animated that on the stage, I think with like three sleepers who would turn as the students were reciting some portion of this Himes writing. And then at the end, and there were other scenes in between from, like Octavia Butler's Street Sounds, a story about kind of, traveling across Los Angeles in a post-apocalyptic world where we've lost the opportunity to speak. And, that travel was interesting in terms of students animating the bus and without sound, without speaking, like what is our capacity for communication? And then we ended with this poem by Lucille Clifton about the historic turning of time. And so the students together, some Black students, Asian students, South Asian students, Middle Eastern students, white students, it was a very diverse class, were intensely engaged in processing the emotions of this particular moment and now theorizing it in this both internally dark with the Himes and sort of hopeful way with the Clifton towards transformation. And I got the opportunity to to write it and get it published. So you have access to the work that the students did, digital access online. I've been talking a long time again. I apologize.
No, Prof.
But what was so lovely,
Regrettably, the point
yeah.
of the podcast is not that I talk, but that you talk. Much as I would love it if I could do some white mansplaining to you, but that's not the point of the
One
exercise.
of the
Far
students,
from
a
it.
white male student, was a trumpet player. One of the white male students was a trumpet player. He opened the show with taps, and that was his choice, which is really the kind of sounding of the coming of the evening. Um, and so that opening was kind of an opening into darkness. Uh, they did, they did. I mean, and so so kinetically with their kind of intellectual engagement, they're the students then in close by created this opportunity to do this intensely deep theorizing about the world, the way the world works, about their body in relation to social experience and feeling, about their own hopes towards the society that they want to see, their own mourning about these losses that weren't their own personal losses, while also kind of developing a critical relationship to, okay, what happened? Who did what? How did this happen? What are the conditions that created this situation? And for them, I think in this piece, how do we get out of it? So close by is about the closeness developed to these issues, the closeness developed between the students, the creative opening that they allowed themselves to do, and this notion to being close, being near each other, close by, right? Sort of dealing with this notion of the possibility of intentional aware proximity and that sort of, grieving release uh, of the salute, the goodbye um, to the day, to the lost in the playing of taps that the student. And I'm not quite sure, they have to kind of reflect on their writing at the end is like, reflect, what'd you do? Why'd you do it? What else would you do if you had all the resources in the world? What do you think the impact was? I'm not sure that they were thinking about the power of their own collaboration. I don't know if the student who played taps at the beginning for us was making it was his theoretical invention, I think, came from an emotional choice. He didn't theorize taps as an opening into darkness for us in his final uh, reflection. I don't know. And so to me, I think that this conversation actually uh, helps me to even understand kind of what it was they were at. You know, what were the students about in the moment, what we're doing. And I think that's also one of the wonderful things about performance, creativity, is that it resonates beyond our own intentions for Lucky.
Prof, I have one more question for you, and
Mhm.
and then you get the prize. No, and once you've answered it, that is if you answer correctly, of course. Right?
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh, look
Okay.
out! It's assessment time. Um, Once you've answered it, I'd like to give you the opportunity to add anything you wish. And that might take the form of going over
Mhm.
terrain we've already covered, where you want to say something more, or where we haven't discussed something and you want to pop up with some thoughts. Does that sound okay as a means of bringing things to a close?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Mhm.
So up to now, I've been asking you about work that I've read. So I've got at
Mm,
least, some familiarity with it. But I'm going to ask you now about your book, Darkening Mirrors, which I couldn't get a
mm,
copy of. Obviously,
mm,
here in Mexico, we have good resources in lots of ways, intellectually and culturally, obviously, but academic scholarship is not well represented often in libraries. So
mm.
there's my mea culpa. But for other people who may not have read the book, could you tell us about it? It's historical, so it's a bit different from some of the work you've been discussing up to now, which is also based in the past, but this is based a long way back.
Yeah, the work that I'm doing now became historical as I was working on it. And it's an interesting study. The current work is an interesting study in our shift to digitization because between 1990 and 2010, actually, the way we collect and store and make things available has so radically changed. Um, that doing a study that's about this period has been doing a study sort of in the midst of and in some ways and in better ways about that change. And so I said I wanted to do an above ground project after doing Darkening Mirrors because Darkening Mirrors was so deeply archival. I was in the Library of Congress looking at performance materials from the Federal Theater Project from the 1930s. And the Federal Theater Project was one of the arts arms of the Works Progress Administration. And the Works Progress Administration, called the WPA, was a federal works program to get the country out of the Depression. And so the government was paying people to work so that people wouldn't starve. And so we can understand, I mean, a lot of our national infrastructure was built during this time. Canals, bridges, trains that weren't built by, robber barons and industrialists, train tracks, harbors, just like in the 1930s, the Depression, getting out of the Depression, the WPA became a mechanism for enormous modernization in the United States, but also really a socialist program of, how do we put people to work? Farming even, but there was an arts arm. There was an arm that writers worked for, and there was a federal theater project where there were these Negro units of the WPA Federal Theater Project who were making plays. And because these plays were meant to put people to work, they had casts of like 170 people. You know, we're lucky if we can fund like a play that has five people in it. It's very expensive these days. But one of the signature plays, actually the play that the cover of the book is drawn from is called the Voodoo is Macbeth. It's a black version of performance of Macbeth from 1938 that's set in Haiti during the Haitian Revolution, so 100 years earlier, 130 years earlier. Um, that was performed in New York at the Lafayette Theater and directed by this young white boy called Orson Welles, who became one of our famous American modernists, who is 20, and now directing 170 Black people in Harlem in the Macbeth. So one of the things I do is I take auteurship away from Orson Welles because I was like, there's no way he was in charge of that room. So there's no way. Yeah, and so I study the way in which these performances, I'm going to use a cultural studies word now called deployed, um, imperialist structures towards a definition of Black subjectivity. And that's another cultural studies word. So, maybe your listeners are familiar, but with my students, I have to say something like, subjectivity means being subject to the forces around you, but also subject to your own life, right? Something like that. And uh, and so play after play, there was a and so that there's something in that performance where dressing up as early 19th century Haitian revolutionaries who were former slaves and who were Maroons and fugitives fighting against French imperial power was really primitivist and also, in some ways, imperialist in the appropriation of uh, French imperial garb, like military aristocratic uniforms. And so I was interested in looking at the juxtaposition between these two imperial forms, right, on the bodies and through the production, for the most part, of Black artists. Often Black people are the object or the conduit for conceptualizations of imperial power through representation. And I was like, I don't think that what's going on in these plays is about mimicry or not, or irony. Both mimicry and irony make the Black subject secondary to white thought making and epistemology. And so I wanted to look at how these plays were loci for African American projection of ship, race, imperialism, and colonial history. They brought all these things together. And so each chapter in this book is about a different imperial discourse that in the 1930s, Black performers were taking up and in some way enacting. I look at a Chicago performance of The Mikado, which is an imperialist play of Black performers in Chicago in the 1930s um, in yellowface. Of you know criticism and history. There were moments in this book where I'm like looking at the census records from 1890, 1900, 1910, and 1920 to try and figure out if this one actor named Edward Fraction, who looks like an old white man to me in this all-colored production of The Mikado, is Black. And it was ambiguous throughout all of those census what is it that looking at the census, I could see where he was, where his family was from, where he moved, and no, not very much information about his race, which meant either that he was white and passing as black to be in this play, which is in itself fascinating, or the ambiguity had to do with other passing histories in his family. Um, an ambiguity that served him. And so I was really fascinated. Just in that moment, that actor from these pictures I saw of him playing the Mikado, like, and the celebration of this all-colored play in PR from Chicago at the time. It was fascinating. That play, The Mikado, performed in Chicago. So there's a chapter on Orientalism, and that chapter is on Orientalism that was stolen from the Federal Theater, and the Federal Theater was not allowed to compete, right? Still capitalism with private theater. So someone poached the show and then performed it in New York with Bill Robinson, famous black tap dancer from the 20th century. So there are all these layers and details that this particular historical project allowed me to sort of saturate myself in that I quite loved, while also trying to reshape the way in which we are understanding and using theory, blackness, representation, appropriation, primitivism, Orientalism, expansion, ethnography, um, even, you know, concepts of like domestic militarism towards World War II, as a process of articulating modernity and inclusion. Um, this is what this book does.
Beautiful. Well, you've given us a great taste, and I definitely want to get hold of it. So to finish off, Prof,
Yeah.
got about 5 minutes left. Is there anything you want to add? As I said, that might be
Mhm.
something entirely new, or it could be going over terrain we've already partially traversed.
I mean, I think I want to come back to this concept of academics studying what they fear. And I think that in performance and performance studies, it's quite the opposite. That scholars embrace what we love. Um, and I just wanted to put that out there as another way of kind of thinking about what we do, that we have to follow what we're obsessed with. And I'm not sure that that obsession or that inkling that won't leave you alone is necessarily about fear. Um, I really think that the project that I'm finishing up right now is very much about, love. How do I love into this community? How do I love the memory of my cousin? How do I sort of represent and stand for people who are very much speaking for themselves, to themselves, and yet not heard? How do I, love towards the inaccessible and the ineffable to deal with something that we're afraid of talking about? Um, And then I also wanted to say something about, the span of my work that is across theory, history, analytical scholarship, performance, um, and poetry, is that, I've been, I think I mentioned I've been trying to find a way to allow some of these things to come together, in my career across writing and pedagogy and, you know, uh, creativity, creative work. Um, and I really kind of loved trying to embrace myself as an artist. I feel very comfortable in my identity as a scholar and a critic and a theorist. And I think that the thing that I'm loving seeing with my students and working on with myself is like, okay, how do I accept and embrace myself as an artist? What does that mean? Where does that go? Uh, I am probably happy to write poetry as I've been writing for my entire life and let it be something that doesn't have to be for public consumption. But I'm also interested in like, okay, where does this poetry live? What is the nature of artistry for me continually in making knowledge, theory, and moving people? I've been thinking recently about, not necessarily legacy, but contribution. When I go, are people going to be reading Darkening Mirrors? I'm not so sure. But if I leave a poem behind for someone that can move them or change their life, that's a contribution I can really get behind. And so I'm interested in kind of the spectrum of productivity and just really grateful for the opportunity to be here doing this that allows me to think in these ways, work in these ways, imagine contribution in this, you know, spectrum of ways.
Well, thank you so much, Prof. Your work is terrific, but I feel as though I've learned a lot more from you today than I have from the fantastic stuff you write, because there's something about ironically, in terms of what you were saying, the embodiment of you in your words spoken
Hmm.
that has really dynamized me. And it's been much more interesting than the bachelorette party going on around me. So
But I'm glad they gave us flowers and applause.
you got incredible applause, not as much as the dude with the beard, but he was walking by us actually. So it was sort of thanks to you. But in all
There you go.
sincerity, you were great, and I'm deeply appreciative. Thank you so, so much. And if at any point in the future you're interested in maybe, with a couple of your students coming back to the pod for an episode talking about some of the questions you've discussed in terms of pedagogy, theory, performance, that would be lovely.
Oh gosh,
I think we're
they produced.
frozen there.
I'm sorry, I lost you.
Yes, I was just saying I've got a rather unstable internet connection here. I was just saying that if you wanted to come back at any
Mhm.
point to the pod, maybe with some of your students to talk about these questions of theory, pedagogy, practice, that would be great.
Oh, they would love it. I
Thank you,
can think of
Prof.
like 10 people. Thank you so much.